Hi, Mike Brantley, auctioneer. Discussing something auctioneers talk about quite a bit, which is termed pre-auction estimates. I even have the question periodically, should I put out a pre-auction estimate of what the item is thought to be worth to help guide bidders to realize what the value is? And I think largely I'm not sure that's necessary in today's environment with the internet and the able to search, and unless the item is just terrifically rare and hard to comp or hard to find a recent sale of like kind, for the most part, people can figure out what it's worth. It's not that difficult. Nonetheless, auctioneers use pre-auction estimates in basically two ways. On the one hand, auctioneers might come to a seller with let's say it's $1 million painting. Let's just say that the auctioneer thinks really, genuinely, this paintings like it, bring about $1 million. And so to encourage bidding in excess of $1 million, the auctioneer might say, well, we believe the pre-auction estimate of this painting is somewhere between 2 million up to as high as 5 million. We're trying to convince bidders that it's worth more than $1 million. I'm not sure we can convince them of that with that type of strategy, but I think that's the intent. And then secondly, when I sit down with a seller and I say, oh, you think this is only $1 million painting? We think it runs maybe as high as 5 million. That seller says, well, I've got some other paintings in the garage. If you're thinking they're worth this much, I might consign even more. So you might fool a seller into having even more trust in you because you think it's worth more than they thought it was worth or their comps suggested. Are you fooling any bidders by putting a higher than market value pre-auction estimate on the item? I'm not sure you are. And lastly, if it sells for $1 million and you had a $2 to $5 million estimate, doesn't look like you did your job. You came in below expectations. You might have a seller who says, what happened to that 5 million? They never remember the 2 million. They remember the 5 million. What happened to that? And you didn't fool any bidders. The seller's upset. You didn't get enough for it. When you got exactly the right price, you just framed it wrong. Now, the other side of pre-auction estimates, let's talk about that. Let's say an auctioneer takes that $1 million painting in and says to the seller, well, they used to sell for $1 million, or that's actually a different artist that sells for $1 million. This is his younger brother, and his stuff sells more in the $250,000 to $500,000 range. Now, beyond just falsifying, misrepresenting, lying to the seller, auctioneer, in essence, lowers expectations with the seller, puts a $1 million painting on the site with a pre-auction estimate of $250,000 to as much as $500,000. Now, the seller might say, well, I think that's $1 million painting. I'm not going to give you any other paintings. We might not get that seller to trust us to handle much more for them. We might lose the deal over that, quite frankly, but what's that low estimate do for the auction? Well, if I can sell a $250,000 to $500,000 painting for $1 million, I've got a press release. I've got a news release. I'm going to contact everybody I know and say, hey, you know how good we are? We just sold a $250,000. I always remember the lower number, for a $250,000 painting for $1 million, 4 times the estimate. And maybe I get more sellers come to me say, well, I've got a $250,000 painting I'd love to get $1 million for. But your current seller maybe isn't all that happy. So there's no perfect fit. With a high pre-auction estimate, you might fool some bidders into thinking it's worth more. The seller is going to be disappointed that it didn't bring as much as the pre-auction estimate. Low pre-auction estimates. Bidders are all about that. You can get those to come in. You got a nice news release that you're exceeding expectations, but you might not get that seller to feel like, well, if you only think it's worth that, then I'm not going to consign anymore. Now, maybe down the road they see as a future seller, hey, they exceeded expectations or their expectations. That brought $1 million, brought a lot more than a quarter to a $500,000. I've got other paintings to consign. So there's no perfect answer. I think maybe in the best case, pre-auction estimates aren't really necessary any further. You could put a number. You could say our comps suggest or we expect, and if that's right in the ballpark as to what you think it's going to, where you think it's going to end, that might be the best practice, giving the seller a realistic feel of where we think we're going to end up, giving buyers a realistic feel of where they are, where their bids will likely have to be to get to that number. I don't know that exaggerating it one way or the other saves the auctioneer from some potential disappointment, liability. You're selling $250,000 paintings for $1 million, and or you're selling $5 million paintings for $1 million. Somebody's going to be wondering how that happened. So I would just guide auctioneers to be careful. And I do think with the internet, I think back when information wasn't so available, pre-auction estimates served a much more valuable purpose because people just they didn't know, there wasn't any way to gauge. I think with today's, I appraise. I'm an appraiser. I appraise real estate. I appraise personal property. I have for decades, and I rarely, if ever, do I find something and say, gee, I can't find a comp, or I can't find a value, or I can't find, and we've had items anywhere from a couple bucks up to in the millions of dollars. You can almost always find comparable sale data to base your value on. Pre-auction estimate from the buyer standpoint, I don't really need you to do that. And for that matter, sellers aren't that ill-informed either. Mike Brantley, Auctioneer. Pleasure to be with you today. Other videos on this same page, others forthcoming. Have a great day and stay safe.